Debunking the myth that First Nations peoples are unfit parents. The First Nations peoples of Canada are the predominant Indigenous group in the country, alongside Métis and Inuit people. As there are many different bands and communities within the First Nations population, they all have their own beliefs, cultures, and views. A few examples include sun dances, green corn ceremonies, and potlatches, which are all different practices with different meanings performed by various First Nations and other Indigenous communities. One thing that First Nations and most Indigenous people have in common, however, is their constant fight for the recognition and survival of their culture. The Indian Act residential schools and outlawing cultural practices are a few examples of the many assimilation policies forced upon Indigenous people in Canada by the government. This caused a loss of language, culture, and customs, negatively impacting past and current generations. Misconceptions and stereotypes about Indigenous people that already existed were further emphasized by these policies. One of these misconceptions is the myth that states that Indigenous people, specifically First Nations people, are not capable of being good parents as they are abusive, neglectful, and overall undeserving of children. Debunking this myth will require examining how colonial assimilation policies, specifically sending First Nations children to residential schools, deprive these same children from gaining strong parenting skills. The reason for choosing this topic of research was to address an assumption that we have all heard repeatedly from people who are poorly educated about the history of First Nations. This myth overgeneralizes the parenting skills of some First Nations parents and completely disregards the obvious source of negative experiences that these children endured that led to parenting repercussions when they became parents. We believe as settlers that it is important to not only educate ourselves by debunking this myth and doing proper research on its source, but also sharing our findings with the public to spread knowledge on Indigenous people and the role that colonial societies had and still have in the writing of their history.
How and why the myth is untrue. The indigenous people influenced their next generations because they were influenced by residential school too much. The first condition of the body paragraph will show how the residential school influenced the parenting in the society of the indigenous people. Because they are dominated by the white people or the state people, and they learned how to lecture children by punishment, or they want to abrogate their bad temper to their families by using some extreme methods. This myth is terrible for the environment in right now society. Bad parenting can lead the case characteristic become low self-esteem, depression, extreme personality. A loving environment is the most vital thing for children's growth. When they feel they are surrounded by loving and caring, they will become a caring girl or gentleman in the future. For sure, their future family will be so sweet and happy. Conversely, the bad teaching to children will drive their thoughts to the extreme point. They saw their parents punish each other, so they will be affected by it, and maybe do that to their wives and husbands in the future when they meet the same situation. Also, some children have low affordability. They will try to end their lives or hurt others. Bad parenting usually happens when the families have a lot of abuse, or when the children feel they are ignored by people. Then they will feel so hard to make friends and trust others. What the difference is between European and First Nations in parenting their children. In this text, it showed before the European people sent the First Nations children to the residential schools. The First Nations treated their kids very well. They inspired their potential in their interests. Then the parents let them do works on their interests. But when the Europeans saw this good atmosphere, they changed it. Europeans sent the First Nations kids to the residential schools. They used brutal ways to control and limit the children. They taught them how to punish each other and let them spread out these ruthless ideas. Europeans were so inhuman at that time compared to the First Nations.
How did residential schools contribute to intergenerational trauma in a contemporary context? As previously stated, First Nations peoples in Canada are survivors of the negative effects of assimilation policies that the government integrated against them, or as some people in Western society still believe, for them. Past generations, post-European settlers, present generations, and future generations will all suffer from the social, economic, and political outcomes of colonialism. One of these assimilation policies includes residential schools, which had the objective to eliminate the Indian in the child by completely isolating children from their families, cultures, traditions, and lifestyles, and depriving them from the essential care and love needed during childhood. This inevitably resulted in intergenerational trauma, where the maltreatment of a child significantly increases the chances that the child from the next generation will also experience maltreatment.
As Tanya Talaga states in one of her Massey lectures, many Indigenous children are born into this world with normative instability, as their parents were born in the residential school conditions. As a result, many suffer from substance abuse, poverty, and are unable to be parents themselves because of their own disruptive upbringing.
An intergenerational trauma survivor from 5 generations of strong Aboriginal women, Rosewater, or First Flower of Spring, a name translated from Old Anishinaabe, states, I was forced to grow up too fast. When my mom's pain became unbearable, she'd take it out on my sister and me, or numb it with alcohol. Still, she fought like a bear to keep us safe from the sexual abuse that so wounded her when she was young. As a result of these traumatic experiences, many survivors have developed mental disorders. In a sample of 127 British Columbia residential school survivors, 64% were diagnosed with PTSD, 26.3% were diagnosed with substance abuse disorder, and 21.1% major depression. The consequences of these schools go beyond the survivors and affect their families, friends, and their communities. This is because the way that children cope with stressful situations can severely alter their behavior, attitudes, and their perception of what's right or wrong, including future parenting behavior. This results in violence, abuse, physical illnesses, addictions, depression, and suicide, continuing to affect generation after generation as the burden of unresolved societal issues continues to linger in the lives of First Nations. How settler and colonial societies may have benefited from this myth. The existence of the myth that First Nations people are unfit parents benefited colonial societies in a magnitude of ways. In order to understand these benefits, we must examine historical examples of colonial societies dismissing the history of Indigenous people and how they benefited from this dismissal. As explored in the Sisters and Spirits Haudenosaunee Iroquois influence on early American feminism book, when people of certain socio-political economic forces are excluded from history, they simply rewrite it. As these same people demand to be remembered, uncomfortable topics are simply erased. There are many examples of Western society erasing and disregarding the pain and suffering that they have imposed on Indigenous people throughout the centuries. This includes the dismissal of Indigenous peoples' doctrine of discovery of the Americas, which in turn painted settlers as the first to discover America and therefore the rulers of the land. Another example of the dismissal of Indigenous peoples' history is the existence of residential schools, or more specifically, the reality of violence and abuse that the students had to endure while they attended. If If it wasn't for the relentless resistance of Indigenous people, residential schools might have never been mentioned or addressed by the Government of Canada. After all, it took them 12 years between the closure of the last residential school in 1996 to Stephen Harper's apology on behalf of Canadians for the schools in June 2008. Furthermore, the creation of the myth that First Nations parents don't have good parenting skills further justifies why the government voluntarily ripped children from their families and communities and forced them to attend residential schools in order to ensure that they were properly raised. The continual dismissal of the truth of Canadian history leaves uneducated society members with a low interest in questioning the validity of myths like this one, while continuing to support settlers' false version of Canada's discovery. The reality of parenting in Western societies.
In Western societies, it is common to point fingers at cultures and societies that differ from their own in order to divert attention away from the atrocities being committed in their own countries. So while many settler colonists did and do perpetuate the myth that First Nations peoples are terrible parents, they fail to self-reflect and look inward upon the parenting issues within their own culture. Let's take a look at the reality of the topic of parenting in Western colonial societies. At the time of residential schools, how were people in Western societies parenting their children? For starters, corporal punishment, hitting one's child, in Canada was and still is perfectly legal, despite many studies by medical experts reporting that it does deep psychological damage to children. There is a strong correlation between spanking and the development of mental illnesses, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics. Excessive use of corporal punishment is linked to higher levels of aggression, lower levels of moral internalization, and poorer mental health in children and adults. However, this law has not been altered very much since its introduction in 1892. Section 43 of the Criminal Code currently states that parents, or people in parenting roles, may use some degree of physical force to discipline their children who are between 2 and 12. And while there are restrictions on the type of physical force that is legally permitted, the psychological damage that occurs as a result from corporal punishment should be enough evidence to prove that this practice in parenting is not a healthy or ethical one. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself stated that corporal punishment is a relic of a discredited past that has no place in Canadian schools or homes. Evidence clearly supports this statement. Furthermore, hitting one's child in a manner that is legally permitted can be a gateway to abuse, as the frequent use of corporal punishment has been linked to an increase in the likelihood of physical abuse. While the law does not permit the use of objects, hitting on the head, or hitting out of anger or because of loss of temper, there is no doubt that this indeed does occur in Canada and Western societies at large. Domestic violence and child abuse rates are still far too high in Canada, with 33% of Canadians reporting in 2014 that they experienced childhood mistreatment, defined as physical and/or sexual abuse before the age of 15 by someone over the age of 18. Abuse experienced by children in Canada also often goes unreported altogether, with 93% of victims of physical and/or sexual abuse saying they never told police about their experiences, according to a 2014 General Social Survey. All of this data is contemporary, but what about Western colonial parenting in the time period when residential schools were open and running? Before a Supreme Court ruling in 2004, limitations on corporal punishment were minimal. There were little restrictions on the type of physical punishments parents could inflict upon their children, so parents could use objects to hit their children, hit their teenagers, and hit their children who had disabilities, which prevented them from understanding the so-called corrective goals of corporal punishment, all without being held criminally responsible. Furthermore, the argument that First Nations peoples are poor parents was often justified by the idea that First Nations children traditionally are economic providers, or help their families by working. When residential schools were first opening in the 1870s, child labor laws in Canada were only just beginning to pass. Before child labor laws, children under the ages of 15 and 16 in Canada were able to be economic providers for their families, but this could often lead to the exploitation and subjugation of children, which often occurred in Western colonial families. So once child labor laws began to pass and attending school was a requirement for children, the government used these laws to justify taking Aboriginal children away from their families and homes. First Nations methods of teaching and learning were devalued and dismissed as child labor, and their children were taken away. Yet at these residential schools, these very children were no longer protected by child labor laws. They did not get a proper education at these schools and instead were exploited and required to work in unsafe, unhealthy, and illegal conditions. And many parents of the Western colonial culture continued to exploit their own children and force them to work in unsafe conditions as well. It is also obvious from the violence, neglect, and abuse perpetuated by an overwhelming amount of the nuns, priests, and teachers in charge of residential schools, all of whom were products of the Western colonial culture, that poor parenting is something that thrived in Western colonial society. As caretakers and mentors of their students, they were in a parenting role. In this role, they exhibited terrible, violent parenting skills. Much of this abuse was fueled by racism. However, these authority figures in residential schools could very well have treated their own children, if they ever had any, the same way. All of this goes to show that parenting in Canadian society was and is far from perfect. Too many parents in Western colonial societies use methods that are physically, mentally, or emotionally harmful, or all three. Abuse, neglect, and violence in the family is unfortunately something that is experienced in all societies, and Western colonial societies are certainly no exception. Physical and psychological harm experienced in childhood can manifest itself into mental illness in adolescence and adulthood, and the cycle of abuse can be passed down from one generation to the next. The topic of one's abuse experienced as a child and openly criticizing one's own parents' methods of parenting is still a taboo topic in Western society. However, there is no doubt that it has occurred for generations and continues to occur. In conclusion, the myth that First Nations parents are all abusive, incapable of parenting, and have poor parenting skills is stereotypical, harmful, and untrue. It fails to take into account colonial and contemporary policies and practices perpetuated by Western settler colonists and governments, including the residential school system, which did extensive damage to First Nations families. It ignores the reality of intergenerational trauma, how residential schools stripped away the ability of First Nations to parent their children, and the ability of these children to develop healthy ideals of love, family, and parenting. Furthermore, the myth is based off of only a small sample of First Nations parents. Not all parents were or are abusive or neglectful, but this myth overgeneralizes a large, diverse demographic. It fails to take into account other ways of parenting that differ from the mainstream Western styles of parenting. Since it is perpetuated especially by people of Western societies, they often lack insight, dismissing and equating non-mainstream parenting with poor parenting. It does not take into account that child neglect in Aboriginal families, cited for taking children from their families and into foster care, is often because of poverty and lack of resources as a result of colonialism, not an intentional neglection of children. This myth benefited settler colonial societies as it justified stripping First Nations of their right to have and parent children, and justified the assimilative policies aforementioned. In a contemporary sense, it justifies the Millennium Scoop, the taking away of First Nations children from their parents and placing them into non-Indigenous foster care homes. It gives the government and settlers a free pass from taking responsibility for the real reason why there is abuse, neglect, poverty, and intergenerational trauma within First Nations communities and families. Finally, the myth ignores the fact that abuse and poor parenting exists in Western colonial societies. Poor parenting skills do not belong exclusively to any one racial group. Western colonial societies are certainly no exception to poor parenting and abuse. Western parents can be abusive, neglectful, and violent, with corporal punishment and domestic violence being perpetuated in many of these families. Overall, this myth is false. We hope that with further education on the topic of the residential school system, intergenerational trauma, and on both historical and contemporary practices of colonial violence and policies in Canada, that people will no longer believe or perpetuate the myth that First Nations peoples are bad parents. People need to learn about the contributing factors to abuse and neglect in some First Nations families by understanding intergenerational trauma and the reasons behind it. They must understand that there are many different ways of parenting that differ from Western styles, but that are still valid. They also should recognize that there are flaws and examples of poor parenting in Western societies as well. We hope after becoming educated on these topics, they will empathize with Indigenous peoples and understand that this myth about First Nations parents is false.